Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we walk through stone and silence where stories were written not just with ink but with guilt. This is a cathedral of secrets. Before we begin, take a slow breath. Feel the quiet settle around you, the same quiet that fills old cathedrals after the choir has gone home. Every echo here has memory. Every wall remembers what people tried to forget. You see, ink can record truth, but it can also hide it. And sometimes the most beautiful handwriting conceals the darkest intention. Tonight's story begins with a quill, a promise, and a lie that was meant to save a holy place, and ruined a life instead. So pour yourself something warm, tea perhaps, or coffee, and settle into the calm. Let the sound of rain on glass remind you that history never fully dries. Every word leaves a trace, even when it fades from the page. As you listen, ask yourself this. If your own story were written by your conscience, what color would the ink be? Would it be black bold, certain, honest, or violet soft, beautiful and slightly deceitful? What happens when a single drop of falsehood lands on sacred parchment? When a kind act becomes a crime not out of greed, but out of desperation? That is what Miss Marple will uncover tonight, not just a murder, but a moral stain that time tried to erase. Make yourself comfortable. The candles are lit, the rain has begun, and the truth, like ink, is about to flow. Have you ever seen truth written twice? The rain came softly over Winchester Close, not heavy enough to send anyone running, just the kind that blurs edges, softens footsteps, and makes old stones glisten like memory. Miss Jane Marple stood beneath her small grey umbrella, watching the drops trace thin silver lines along the carved saints above the cathedral door. Her goddaughter, Felicity Carmichael, walked briskly beside her heels, clicking with youthful certainty. "It's not quite Street Mary. Mead, is it?" Felicity said, smiling. "No," Miss Marple replied. "Much older, and perhaps better at keeping its secrets." The two women paused beneath the cloister arch. Beyond it stretched the green court, walled by centuries, framed by dripping ivy. At its far end stood the library wing, where the retreat was being held. "Writers in the close," the leaflet had said. A few scattered figures hurried through the rain, clutching notebooks and thermoses like offerings. Felicity shook out her umbrella. "It's rather exciting, Aunt Jane. All these authors and scholars under one roof. You'll love Dr. Arkwright. His novels are quite famous." "I expect they're very dramatic," Miss Marple murmured, eyes still following the wet cobbles. She watched a drop slide down one of the stone gargoyles, pause, tremble, then fall. "Though I find real life usually manages more drama than any fiction." Inside the cloisters, the air carried the scent of wet limestone and candle wax. Somewhere, a bell rang slow and measured. Marple adjusted her gloves, glancing at the people gathering ahead. A tall, thin clergyman with nervous hands. A woman in a brown habit balancing an old leather folio. A young lady with ink stains on her fingers, looking everywhere but at the others. Felicity whispered, "That's Canon Wynne, and the lady with the folio must be Sister Mary. Oh, and the one with the smudged cuffs is Clara Phipps, Dr. Arkwright's assistant." Miss Marple nodded slightly. First impressions, she had always found, were like the first few stitches of a pattern, simple to make, but impossible to undo. A gust of wind swept through the open arch, scattering the scent of rain and something else. Old paper, perhaps, or unease. Marple looked up. Through the misted glass of the cathedral's west window, a faint light trembled, as if uncertain whether to stay or vanish. She smiled to herself. "Such lovely weather for a mystery," she said. Felicity laughed. "Oh, Aunt Jane, not everything is a mystery." Miss Marple gave her a gentle look. "My dear, in my experience, everything is." And as the rain deepened to a steady rhythm against the stones, the day began quiet, courteous, and already a little too perfect. The main hall of the close had that faint echo only old buildings possess, a sound shaped by centuries of careful footsteps and whispered prayers. Miss Marple and Felicity entered just as the first group of guests began to gather around a display table draped in dark velvet. Canon Humphrey Wynne stood at its center, trying very hard to appear composed. He was a thin man with a face that seemed permanently on the verge of apology. His clerical collar gleamed with the polish of habit, yet his hands betrayed him trembling faintly as he arranged pamphlets that refused to stay in a neat pile. "Ah, welcome, welcome," he said, his voice warm but uncertain. "Miss Carmichael and Miss Marple, is it not? So delighted you could join our humble literary retreat. A fine cause: preservation, education, inspiration." His smile flickered, then steadied. Behind it, Jane sensed the strain of a man stretched between faith and finances. "We're very grateful for the invitation," Miss Marple replied kindly. "I'm told there will be readings and lectures." "Yes, indeed," Canon Wynne said. "Our guest of honor arrives any moment, Dr. Leonard Arkwright, the celebrated historian and novelist." He straightened a poster as though it were an act of devotion. Quite a name in his field, though, not without opinions. The door opened, and opinions arrived. Dr. Leonard Arkwright entered with the calm assurance of someone used to admiration. Silver hair, well-cut coat, and the sort of posture that suggested confidence had long ago hardened into habit. He offered a polite bow to the room, then to Canon Wynne. "My dear Canon," he said smoothly, "a pleasure to find such beauty still standing against the centuries. One almost forgets how much English stone can outlast English vanity." Wynne laughed uncertainly, unsure whether it was praise or philosophy. "Dr. Arkwright," he said, "this is Miss Marple, one of our most perceptive local minds, and Miss Carmichael, her daughter." Arkwright shook their hands with courteous charm. "The keenest minds," he said, "are often found in the quietest villages." Before Miss Marple could answer, a soft voice interrupted. "Dr. Arkwright, the manuscripts are ready for your inspection." It belonged to a young woman standing half in shadow, Clara Phipps. Ink stains on her cuffs, a smudge across her wrist, and a look of someone who'd spent too long among pages and too little among people. Arkwright turned toward her with a smile too practiced to be kind. "Excellent, Miss Phipps. I trust you've handled them with your usual, delicate precision." "Yes, sir," she said, eyes down. Jane watched the brief exchange like a chess move, gentle on the surface, tactical underneath. Felicity whispered, "She looks frightened of him." "Or loyal," Jane murmured. "The expressions are sometimes similar." Across the room, Arkwright was already surrounded by admirers. Canon Wynne hovered nearby, half proud, half anxious. And Clara, the invisible center of their small constellation, stood apart, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the quill in the display case. Rain beat softly on the high windows. Somewhere in that sound was a warning no one yet heard. The display table stood beneath the nave's arched window, where colored glass filtered the rainlight into pools of gold and crimson. Upon it rested the centerpiece of the day's ceremony, a quill laid on dark blue velvet, beside an ornate silver inkwell and a thick leather-bound book embossed in gold. Canon Wynne stepped forward, hands folded with a reverence that was part devotion, part performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this quill, dated to the 15th century, was once used by the monks of the close to copy sacred texts. Today it returns to service symbolically, of course, to remind us that words still build what walls cannot." A murmur of appreciation passed through the small crowd. Miss Marple moved closer, peering down through her spectacles. The quill was exquisite, the feather white and luminous, even in the dim light, the nib polished to a soft gleam. But her eyes lingered on a detail most others would have missed, a slight unevenness at the metal tip, the faint shimmer of a fresh cut. She tilted her head. The quill's nib had been recently filed, and a tiny shaving of gold was missing no larger than a curl from a pencil sharpener. On the velvet beside it, she saw what looked like a trace of metallic dust. Curious. But she said nothing. Dr. Arkwright leaned over the table with a scholar's hunger. "Magnificent workmanship," he said. "You can tell the craftsman's pride in every line. Remarkable that such artistry survived the centuries." His tone was admiration, yet behind it lay ownership, as though the object's meaning belonged to him alone. Canon Wynne smiled nervously. "You'll have the honor of being the first to sign our Book of Inspiration, Doctor. Each author, each visitor, may add their name as a pledge to preserve our literary heritage." "Ah," Arkwright replied softly. "So it is to be a relic reborn." He picked up the quill with careful fingers, testing its weight. Clara Phipps, standing nearby, stiffened as he dipped the nib into the inkwell. The sound of metal touching glass echoed faintly sharp, deliberate. A few drops of ink fell onto the page. Black, thick, perfect. Arkwright signed his name with elegant strokes. When he was done, he replaced the quill exactly as before, though Miss Marple noticed his hand lingered an instant too long on the nib. Almost protective, almost possessive. Canon Wynne clapped softly. Splendid. The first mark in our book, a historic beginning. Applause followed, polite but uncertain. Marple watched Clara lower her gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the young woman's fingers moved toward her sleeve, brushing at something invisible. Ink, perhaps, or gilt. The rain deepened outside, beating against the high glass. Within the cathedral, the scent of metal and candle wax hung still. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. A new beginning. Yes, but she had learned to mistrust beginnings that came dressed as ceremonies. Something here had already been tampered with. And the missing curl of gold would not stay hidden for long. The cathedral library smelled of dust, candle smoke, and quiet labor. Light from narrow windows fell in thin amber stripes across the long wooden tables. Every sound, the turn of a page, the soft tap of a pen, seemed magnified by the hush. Sister Mary Addison stood near the lectern, a small figure in her brown Benedictine habit. Her hands, lined and steady, rested on a leather portfolio tied with faded ribbons. Around her, the group of retreat guests settled into respectful silence. "My friends," she began, her voice soft yet clear, "what you see here is a piece of England's written soul, a newly discovered royal charter, dating to the reign of Edward III, preserved by God's grace in our cathedral archives." She untied the ribbons and unfolded a sheet of parchment, the color of old ivory. Gold letters glimmered faintly where light touched them, their strokes intricate, confident, alive. Miss Marple leaned forward, fascinated. Even at a distance, she could see that the calligraphy was exquisite, the lines exact, the flourishes elegant. It looked, she thought, almost too perfect. "Doctor." Arkwright moved closer, hands clasped behind his back. His expression had changed, admiration now mingled with calculation. "Remarkable," he said. "One might almost believe it was written yesterday." Sister Mary smiled. "Indeed, the preservation is extraordinary. The parchment was found among a family's donation of papers, the Weatherbys of Hampshire. It speaks of royal privileges once granted to this very cathedral." "Fascinating," Arkwright murmured. "And yet, the pigment in those capitals that gold it holds its brightness, almost unnaturally." His tone was thoughtful, but there was an edge beneath it. The room stirred. Canon Wynne, standing near the shelves, cleared his throat with visible discomfort. "Dr. Arkwright is, of course, an expert in medieval illumination," he said quickly. "His observations are most welcome." Marple's gaze drifted to Clara Phipps, seated at the far end of the table. The young woman's fingers were clasped tightly around her pen, knuckles white. Her lips moved slightly, not in prayer, but as if repeating silent words. Sister Mary continued, unaware of the tension spreading through the room. "The hand who wrote this must have been a master," she said. "Notice how each initial is gilded, every letter a declaration of devotion." Arkwright's eyes flicked toward Clara. "Indeed," he said smoothly. "And some hands are very good at reproducing devotion." The silence that followed was sudden and heavy. Clara's face drained of color. Her pen slipped, leaving a small ink blot on her notes. Miss Marple noticed every detail, the blot, the tremor, the way Clara's eyes darted not to Arkwright but to Canon Wynne. A shared fear, a hidden pact. The rain outside quickened, tapping the tall windows like impatient fingers. Sister Mary carefully replaced the parchment in its case, unaware that her treasure had already divided the room into guilt, suspicion, and silence. Marple sat back, knitting resting on her lap. Her thoughts, as always, were quiet but relentless. The gold might have come from an old century. But the fear in that room that was entirely new, the afternoon tea that followed the lecture, was meant to soothe everyone. It did not. The long table in the refectory gleamed with polished silver and delicate cups. Steam curled above the teapots like faint ghosts. Conversation flowed, but too quickly the way talk does when people are trying to fill a silence they fear. Miss Marple sat beside Felicity, her hands folded neatly on her saucer. Across from her, Dr. Leonard Arkwright was surrounded by a half-circle of admirers, clergy, writers, and two young women taking notes as if every word he spoke was scripture. He was in his element, polite, articulate, and entirely aware of it. Authenticity, he said, stirring his tea with unnecessary precision, is not simply about accuracy, it is about spirit, the ability to resurrect the past with emotional truth. Beautifully said, Canon Wynne murmured, visibly relieved to see the morning's tension softening. The reprieve lasted less than a minute. From the far end of the table came a new voice, louder, confident, tinged with irony. Richard Lyle, the American novelist, leaned back in his chair and smiled. I suppose emotional truth is easier when one borrows the right facts, huh? Doc. The laughter that followed was quick, almost involuntary, but it died just as quickly. Even the sound of the rain seemed to pause. Arkwright turned his head slowly. His smile remained, but the warmth vanished. Borrowed, Mr. Lyle? Lyle lifted his cup. Well, it's just that some of us read early drafts. Familiar themes, familiar sources, familiar phrases even. But perhaps it's just coincidence. The English are very fond of coincidence. A ripple of discomfort passed through the group. Canon Wynne coughed into his napkin. Sister Mary stared at her tea as though it held a prayer. Arkwright's voice stayed calm, a little too calm. Research, he said, is like scripture. It belongs to everyone, though not everyone reads it with comprehension. Lyle laughed. That's one way to call plagiarism poetic. The word hung in the air, a stain no one could wipe away. Clara Phipps shifted in her seat, eyes wide, hands trembling against her teacup. Her spoon clinked softly against the china, a small sound that cut through the silence. Miss Marple watched it all without moving. The glance Arkwright threw at Clara was quick but sharp, a warning, not of fear but control. And Clara's response was worse. Obedience. Felicity whispered. They dislike each other, don't they? Dislike, Miss Marple said softly, is just admiration, turned inside out. Canon Wynne rose hastily, voice trembling with forced cheer. Well now, perhaps we might reconvene in the scriptorium for this evening's signing. The weather's cleared almost. No one believed him, and everyone pretended to. As the guests drifted away, Miss Marple remained a moment longer, eyes on the empty cups, the smudged napkins, the thin violet stain where Clara's ink had spilled earlier. Old wounds, she thought, have a habit of bleeding through new paper, and somewhere between pride and fear someone was already sharpening the next quill. Evening had settled quietly over the close. The rain had stopped, leaving a damp shine on the flagstones. The air smelled of ink, old paper, and candle smoke, a mixture Miss Marple found oddly reassuring. She walked alone toward the scriptorium, where the evening signing was about to begin. Inside, she could already hear the gentle shuffle of guests, the murmur of polite conversation, the faint scratch of a pen across parchment. But in the corridor just outside, a soft voice called after her. Miss Marple, please a moment. It was Clara Phipps. The young woman stood half in shadow near the doorway, her hands clasped around a small satchel. Her face was pale, her eyes held the frightened brightness of someone on the verge of confession. Miss Marple turned, patient and kind. Of course, my dear. Is something troubling you? Clara hesitated, glancing down the corridor to make sure they were alone. Her voice trembled. It's about what happened in the library today, what Dr. Arkwright said. He shouldn't have spoken to me that way. She stopped, words tangled, fear rising behind her eyes. Miss Marple waited in silence, knowing too much sympathy could close a frightened heart as quickly as cruelty. Clara swallowed hard. I think something dreadful is going to happen. I keep telling myself it isn't my fault, but... She broke off again, clutching the satchel tighter. From its open edge, Something slipped a small glass vial no larger than a thumb. It struck the marble floor, rolled once, and shattered. A thin ribbon of violet ink spread across the stone, dark, luminous, unnatural under the candlelight. Clara gasped. "Oh, heavens!" She crouched quickly, fumbling for her handkerchief. But Miss Marple gently touched her arm. "Leave it, child. Ink stains tell more truth when they're left alone." For a moment, Clara froze, startled, almost ashamed. Then she straightened slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. He said it would help. He said no one would know." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Sometimes, Miss Marple, you try to fix something that isn't broken, and that's the mistake, isn't it?" Before Jane could answer, the door to the scriptorium opened. Canon Wynne's voice floated out, cheerful and nervous. "Miss Phipps, Dr. Arkwright is waiting for you. They're ready to begin." Clara flinched. "Yes, Canon. At once." She turned to leave, but paused just long enough to whisper, "Please forget what I said." Miss Marple watched her disappear into the light. The violet stain remained, spreading, slowly across the marble, an accidental confession the floor would remember. And Jane, as always, remembered everything. Dusk deepened around the cathedral like a closing book. The lamps had been lit, their glow soft and amber against the grey stone. Guests lingered near the cloisters, murmuring about the upcoming evening tour, a private ascent to the Triforium, where Canon Wynne promised a spectacular view of faith through architecture. Miss Marple joined the small gathering, her umbrella still damp from the earlier rain. Felicity stood beside her, excitement flickering in her eyes. "I heard we'll see the lantern tower from inside," she whispered. "They say it's breathtaking." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I find breath often leaves the body for less poetic reasons." Canon Wynne appeared near the base of the stairwell, a large iron ring of keys trembling in his hand. He smiled too widely. "Thank you, everyone. Only a short climb, I promise. The steps are narrow, but the view rewards the faithful." Miss Marple studied him quietly. The man's voice wavered, his shoulders drawn tight. There was fear in him, not the fear of height, but of conscience. Behind him, Dr. Leonard Arkwright approached with his usual ease, coat perfectly buttoned, expression composed. He greeted the group as though nothing at all had happened that day. "Shall we?" he said cheerfully. "History always looks better from above." His calmness was unnatural. Even the tone of his politeness carried weight, as if it were another performance. Clara Phipps arrived last. She looked pale beneath the torchlight, her steps hesitant. She avoided Arkwright's eyes. He, however, watched her with the stillness of a man waiting for a result he already knew. As the party prepared to climb, Canon Wynne dropped one of the keys. It clattered across the stone floor, loud, metallic, final. He bent to pick it up, hands shaking. Miss Marple caught his glance as he straightened. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but didn't. Felicity whispered, "He seems terribly nervous." "Yes," Marple said softly. "People do, when truth is about to reach the surface." The group began the ascent. The stairway curved tightly upward, each step worn smooth by centuries. Their footsteps echoed like measured heartbeats. Somewhere above, the faint hum of the cathedral's evening organ carried through the stone. Marple moved slowly, keeping Clara in view. The girl's hand clutched the railing, knuckles white. Arkwright followed close behind, his expression unreadable. He said something softly too low for the others to hear. Clara's shoulders stiffened, her pace faltered. Canon Wynne's voice floated up the staircase ahead. "Mind the corners, the stones can be slick from the damp." At the next landing, Miss Marple paused. She could feel it, that subtle, electric stillness that always came before human error became tragedy. This was not simply a tour, it was a rehearsal for revelation. And somewhere between the railing and the truth, someone would fall. The stairway wound upward in a narrow spiral of stone. Each step echoed faintly, the sound hollow and rhythmic like a slow heartbeat inside the walls. The air grew colder as they climbed. Dust drifted in the lamplight. Electric bulbs hung at intervals, their filaments flickering against the grey. Canon Wynne led the group, one hand brushing the cold railing for balance. Behind him came Sister Mary and Felicity. "Doctor." Arkwright followed, his voice steady, too steady, the practiced calm of a man performing knowledge. Clara Phipps climbed a few steps below him, head bowed, her breath shallow. Miss Marple kept to the rear, eyes sharp, movements unhurried. "Here we are," Wynne called softly, pausing at the first landing. He pointed to carvings etched into the wall, faded words, half Latin, half English. "Messages from the builders. Prayers. Some say confessions." Arkwright's voice rose through the dim air. "Miss Phipps," he said, "come closer. You'll appreciate the script. 14th century, unmistakably." Clara hesitated. "I can see it from here, sir." "Nonsense," Arkwright replied. "A calligrapher should study such beauty at its source." The others watched politely, unaware of the tension thrumming in those few words. Clara stepped up beside him. He gestured toward the carving, his hand resting lightly on the old iron railing. "Note the curve of the letters. You've imitated this hand before, haven't you?" Her eyes widened. I don't know what you mean." A faint tremor ran through her voice, then through the metal beneath their hands. One of the light bulbs flickered sharply, buzzing in protest. Miss Marple felt it, that quiet change in the air, the sound of fear before it becomes action. Arkwright leaned closer. "You should be proud," he murmured. "Your forgery is almost divine." Clara stepped back. "Please don't." The bulb above them flared white, then went dark. Someone gasped. In the brief half-light, there was the scrape of shoes, the snap of rusted metal, a sound small but absolute. The railing gave way. It tore free with a sighing groan, centuries of corrosion letting go at once. Arkwright's body tilted outward, his hand clawing for balance, finding nothing but air. A dull thud echoed from below, one sound, final, swallowed by stone. Silence followed. Not panic, not screaming, only the hollow quiet that comes when shock seals every mouth. The bulbs steadied again, dim and trembling. Canon Wynne stood frozen on the landing, lips parted, eyes wide. Sister Mary began to whisper a prayer. Miss Marple didn't move. She watched the empty space where Arkwright had stood, and the faint dust still drifting down through the light. Then she spoke softly, almost to herself. "When the truth loosens its grip, something always falls." The lanterns burned low in the nave, their light trembling against the stone like breath. The body lay beneath the tower, half hidden by shadow, surrounded by silence. Dr. Leonard Arkwright no longer looked commanding. His fine coat was torn, his silver hair dusted grey with centuries of neglect that had fallen from the rafters. Canon Wynne knelt beside him, murmuring something that was half prayer, half apology. No one interrupted. Even Felicity, pale and shaken, stood motionless near the steps, clutching her gloves as though the world might steady if she held on tightly enough. Miss Marple arrived last. Her pace was slow, her eyes deliberate. She had seen accidents before, only this one did not feel accidental. The air itself seemed to know that. A pair of boots clicked briskly across the stone. Inspector Slack entered, hat still damp from rain, coat unbuttoned. He nodded curtly at the canon. "Well, sir, looks like you've had quite an evening. Let's have the facts before the candles burn out, shall we?" Canon Wynne's voice trembled. "It was dreadful, Inspector. The railing just gave way. He was leaning on it." Slack crouched near the base of the stairs, lamp in hand. He examined the fallen section of metal old iron, split at the joint. Then he frowned. "Funny thing about old iron," he muttered. "It doesn't snap clean. It crumbles. This," he tapped it lightly, "was cut." Marple said nothing. She followed his gaze, noting the smooth brightness of the break amid the rust. And beside it, something else. A small glint on the stone. A streak of color. Violet. She moved closer. Her gloved finger traced a faint smear along the broken edge of the railing ink, not paint. Fresh, still wet in places. Slack noticed her pause. "See something, Miss Marple?" "Only what shouldn't be there," she said softly. "Ink rarely climbs staircases on its own." He gave her a curious look. You're thinking sabotage. I'm thinking preparation, she replied. Someone rehearsed this moment long before the climb. Slack grunted. Could have been tampering. Could have been coincidence. Could have been conscience, Marple murmured. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He'd learned over time that Miss Marple's quiet remarks tended to bloom into revelations later. Nearby, Sister Mary crossed herself, whispering prayers over the still body. Clara Phipps stood apart, eyes fixed on the floor, lips moving without sound. Her inkwell had been recovered from her satchel empty, the cork missing. Marple's gaze returned to the violet stain. It glimmered faintly under the lantern light, like truth pretending to sleep. She folded her hands. Somewhere behind her, rain began again, faint on the high windows. And in that steady rhythm, she heard what others could not, the sound of intention disguised as accident. The railing had broken, yes, but something else had cracked first. Someone's story. Morning broke pale and thin across Winchester Close. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks of silver on the cathedral windows. Inside the library, the air smelled of cold stone and drying paper. Inspector Slack stood at the long oak table, hat in hand, watching Canon Wynne fumble with the visitor's ledger. The book lay open, its thick pages filled with careful names, writers, donors, clergy, and one signature repeated twice. Dr. Leonard Arkwright. Slack's brow furrowed. He signed in the morning, Wynne said weakly, pointing. Before the first lecture. Yes, Miss Marple replied. And again, it seems, after his death. The inspector leaned closer. The first signature was written in bold black ink, clean and confident. The second near the bottom of the next page was the same hand, the same flourish, but violet. Slack gave a low whistle. Could have been copied. Could have been. Planned, Marple said. She bent slightly, adjusting her spectacles. The violet ink shimmered faintly in the light. It was too fresh, the pigment not yet dulled by air. Someone had written it only hours ago. Canon Wynne wiped his forehead. There must be some explanation. Perhaps he signed twice in advance. Marple's tone was gentle but firm. Then we must assume the good doctor foresaw his own death and chose to record his presence from beyond. That seems unlikely, don't you think? Slack gave her a thin smile. You're suggesting forgery. I'm suggesting rehearsal, she said softly. This second entry wasn't written by a stranger. It was written by someone familiar with his hand, his loops, his pride. She ran her gloved finger along the edge of the page, stopping where the ink had bled faintly into the paper grain. Violet the same shade as the stain on the railing. The same tone Clara Phipps used in her demonstrations. Felicity, standing nearby, whispered, "But why forge a signature after he was dead?" "To prove something," Marple answered quietly. "Or to erase something else." Slack turned the ledger toward the light. The corner of the violet page was smudged as though someone had turned it too quickly. A faint fingerprint, thin and small, marred the margin. Not a man's hand. He looked up sharply. "Miss Marple, if you're right, this means someone wanted Arkwright's presence recorded twice. Once while alive, once to cover where he really was." She nodded, and to suggest he returned to the scriptorium voluntarily, which of course he didn't. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the slow creak of the building settling old timbers, remembering too much. Then Marple closed the ledger carefully. "The ink tells us what the voice never will," she said. One truth was written to deceive, the other to hide regret. Slack pocketed his notebook, his tone low. "Seems we're chasing ghosts, Miss Marple." She looked toward the high window, where the first light of morning touched the glass. "Not ghosts, Inspector, just handwriting that refuses to fade." The morning deepened into a cold, colorless noon. A thin wind slipped through the cloisters, carrying the smell of wet metal and incense. In the vestry office, Inspector Slack stood beside a small table where several objects lay neatly arranged. A handkerchief, a notebook, a broken nib, and a slender brass tool flecked with green. Miss Marple watched from a nearby chair, her knitting idle in her lap. The tool caught the light like a confession. It was no larger than a pen, flattened at one end, and ridged for filing. Verdigris clung to its edge, bright as bruised emerald. Slack held it up with a handkerchief. "Found in Miss Phipps's satchel," he said. "Under her sketchbook. You recognize it, Canon?" Canon Wynne hesitated. Yes, of course. It's for maintaining the quill nibs. Clara used it for demonstrations. Every calligrapher keeps one." Marple leaned forward slightly. "Most do," she said softly. "But most don't leave residue of fresh metal on the file, and certainly not gold." Slack glanced at her, then back at the tool. Under the residue of green corrosion was a faint shimmer the color of filed gold. He placed it down carefully. "Fetch Miss Phipps," he said. A constable brought her in a moment later. Clara looked smaller than before, her hands clasped, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She glanced at the table, saw the file, and froze. Slack's voice was even. "You've been busy, miss. Care to explain how this little thing came to carry both brass and gold, and why it was found under your papers after a man fell to his death?" Clara's throat worked silently. "I don't. It's not what you think. I used it on the quill yesterday. Dr. Arkwright asked me to make the nib smoother, just for the ceremony. I didn't," Slack interrupted. "So you admit you filed it?" She nodded weakly. "Yes, but it was nothing, just for show." He said the old nib caught on parchment. Miss Marple's voice entered the quiet like the sound of a page turning. "Did you notice a small curl of gold missing from the tip afterward?" Clara blinked, startled. Yes, but it happens. The filing always leaves shavings." "And did you perhaps notice that the quill no longer wrote in black ink?" Her mouth parted, but no sound came. Her eyes flickered toward Canon Wynne. He looked down quickly, his hands twisting together. Slack leaned on the table. "You see, miss, the problem with brass is, it tells on itself. You can polish it, but the tarnish always comes back. Same with lies." Clara whispered, "I didn't kill him." Marple's tone was kind but unyielding. "No, my dear. But you helped someone prepare the tool that did." The silence thickened. Then she added, almost to herself, "Truth corrodes faster than brass, Inspector. It always shows its color first." Outside, the cathedral bell struck noon, each chime clean, relentless, echoing through every corridor that still held secrets. By the next morning, Winchester Close had lost its calm. The rain had returned, steady and grey, pressing against the stained glass like a second skin. Inside the library, the small circle of guests gathered again, quieter now, wary. Inspector Slack stood near the iron safe, the door wide open, the shelves bare except for a single candle stub and a ribbon of parchment dust. The Royal Charter was gone. Canon Wynne paced behind him, his face drained of colour. He tried to speak, failed, then began again. "It was here. I locked it myself after the lecture. Sister Mary witnessed it." Sister Mary, standing beside Miss Marple, nodded faintly. Her eyes looked older than they had the day before. "Yes, Inspector. I saw him turn the key. He was very particular." Slack examined the lock, then the hinges. No sign of force. Whoever took it had the key. He turned to Wynne. "Anyone else have access?" "No one," Wynne said. "Only me." Marple's gaze moved to the table, where the ledger still lay open from the night before. Violet fingerprints marked the edge of one page. She noticed the Canon's sleeve faint smudge of the same shade. "Canon," she said gently, "perhaps we should all sit. You look rather unwell." He shook his head. "It's not illness, Miss Marple. It's shame." He dropped heavily into a chair. For a moment no one spoke. The air felt heavy with something deeper than deceit, weariness, perhaps, or guilt finally admitting its age. "It was never meant to deceive anyone," he said at last, voice low. "The original charter was damaged, unreadable in places. We reconstructed it for display. A few embellishments, decorative touches, nothing more." Slack's expression hardened. "Enhancements, you mean?" "Yes," Wynne whispered. "For donors. They wanted grandeur, proof of history's blessing upon the cathedral. Dr. Arkwright called it artistic restoration. He said it would help preserve the close. But I see now, He meant to expose it, to humiliate us. Sister Mary's hands trembled around her rosary. Humiliate, she said softly. Canon, you forged a royal decree. You turned devotion into theatre. Her words carried no anger, only grief. Wynne bowed his head. I believed it would save us. The grants, the funding people give more when they believe in glory. Marple's voice was calm, almost kind. Yet glory, once painted over, always begins to flake. Slack closed the safe door gently. Well, that explains the motive for a quarrel. Doesn't explain who stole the parchment. Marple glanced toward the high shelves where dust lay thick, except for one clear patch in the corner the exact shape of a missing folio. Someone, she said softly, wanted the truth to vanish before it was read properly. Sister Mary turned away, whispering a prayer that sounded like apology. Canon Wynne covered his face with both hands. The rain continued against the glass, steady, deliberate, like judgment written in water. Night returned to Winchester Close with the soft weight of secrecy. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and expectant. Inside the cathedral library, only one lamp burned its light, small, golden, and patient. Inspector Slack stood near the door, arms folded, boots silent on the stone. Miss Marple sat a few feet away, her knitting basket at her side, though she wasn't knitting. The faint click of the clock on the mantelpiece marked each passing second. They were waiting. Reminds me of fishing, Slack muttered quietly. Long silences and a hope the fool bites. Marple smiled faintly. Patience, Inspector. The truth prefers dark places. It moves when no one's looking. Outside, the wind moaned through the arches, soft as breath. A minute passed, then two. Somewhere in the corridor a hinge creaked. Slack's hand went to his torch. He flicked it off safety, letting the room sink back into stillness. Footsteps light, careful, crossed the threshold. A shadow moved through the narrow beam of lamplight, slight and deliberate. The figure paused, glancing once toward the shelves, then slipped into the adjoining muniment room. Slack nodded silently to Marple, then followed, each step placed with precision. They stopped at the doorway. Through the half-open door, the intruder knelt at a tall cabinet, drawers half open. A faint scratch of paper on parchment, the whisper of tracing sheets being unfolded. Slack waited, eyes narrowed. He counted 3 heartbeats, then stepped forward. Evening, friend, he said softly. Library hours are rather short tonight. The shadow jerked upright, startled. A lamp swung from the figure's hand, spilling pale light across the room. Clara Phipps froze. Her face was pale, her breath sharp in the cold air. I wasn't stealing, she stammered. I was just looking. Slack's voice stayed even. For what? She didn't answer. The papers slipped from her hands. They fluttered down translucent sheets, marked with careful outlines of old lettering. The air filled with a faint, metallic scent. Marple stooped, picking one up delicately by the corner. Her gloved fingers brushed a fine green dust from its surface. Verdigris, she said quietly. Used in gilding, and in imitation gold ink. Slack turned the torch toward the desk. More tracing paper, brushes, a small pouch torn open, green residue spilled across the grain. Clara's voice trembled. I only meant to correct what he said. He called it forgery. It wasn't. It was restoration. He twisted everything. Marple met her eyes. And so you came back to erase proof of the twist. Tears welled, but Clara shook her head. I didn't push him. I swear it. Slack sighed, holstering his torch. Maybe not. But this, miss, is enough to prove you were rewriting more than parchment. Marple laid the tracing sheet gently on the table. The green powder shimmered faintly in the lamplight as though the forgery itself still glowed with guilt. She spoke softly, half to herself. Ink hides sin. Powder only reveals where it tried to shine. Morning light drifted through the high windows, soft and uncertain, like forgiveness deciding whether to arrive. The library was quiet again, the kind of quiet that follows confession, not prayer. Inspector Slack stood near the hearth, notebook closed. Canon Wynne sat opposite, his face drawn, eyes hollow. Sister Mary had asked to speak before anyone else. Miss Marple, as always, remained still, watchful, calm, hands folded on her lap. Sister Mary's voice trembled, but not from weakness. It trembled from the burden of finally setting something down. "We meant no harm," she began. "When the original charter was found, it was in pieces, brittle, incomplete. Canon Wynne feared it would disappoint the donors. He believed that if we could restore its splendor, the spirit of truth would remain." She paused, looking toward Wynne. He didn't meet her eyes. "I agreed," she continued quietly. "We traced missing lines, we added flourishes, a little gold, a little ornament. Nothing that changed the words, only the impression. We told ourselves it was preservation, not deceit." Slack's tone stayed even. "And Dr. Arkwright found out?" "Yes," she said. He recognized the hand. Clara's. He realized the so-called discovery was too perfect. He confronted the canon privately, demanded that the forgery be admitted publicly. Said he'd write an article exposing us all. Canon Wynne spoke at last, voice brittle as parchment. I begged him to delay, just until the restoration grant was secured. But he wouldn't. He said truth must stand, even if it ruins reputations. Marple's gaze shifted to Clara, seated silently at the far end of the table. Her face was pale, her hands motionless. Sister Mary turned toward her, eyes full of sorrow. She came to me afterward shaking, said he had humiliated her, called her a liar and a fraud. She was terrified he'd destroy her career. I told her to pray for patience. Clara's voice broke through the stillness, low and trembling. I only wanted to frighten him. I swear it. I went to the tower before the others. The railing was loose, just one bolt. I meant to make him stumble, not fall. I thought it would rattle him, make him rethink. Slack's jaw tightened. "You loosened the bolt?" "Yes," she whispered. "Only slightly. But when I returned with the group, it was already worse. I didn't know." Marple leaned forward. "You didn't know?" Canon Wynne had tried to repair that very railing 2 days before. His maintenance failed. The bolt was already half rusted through. Your touch did the rest. Silence. Even the clock seemed to pause. Canon Wynne lowered his head into his hands. Sister Mary crossed herself, whispering through tears. Marple's voice came last, soft, steady, almost merciful. In the end, the truth fell by its own weight. Each lie, each fear, each touch, all tightened the same thread until it broke. No one spoke again. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, as though the building itself mourned the cost of its preservation. Evening settled softly over Winchester Close. The rain had returned, steady but calm, not a storm now, only a rhythm, as though the sky itself were exhaling. Inside the guest parlor, the fire burned low, the light gentle on brass and oak. Steam rose from 2 teacups, curling in quiet spirals toward the mantel. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, her knitting folded neatly beside her. Felicity poured tea, her movements slower than usual, subdued by what the past days had revealed. "Strange," Felicity murmured. "How something as simple as ink can cause so much sorrow." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's rarely the ink, my dear. It's the intention behind it. People imagine they can improve the truth, gild it a little, make it more presentable. But the moment we polish it too brightly, it ceases to be truth at all." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the bells struck 8, slow, deliberate, forgiving. Felicity stirred her tea. "Do you think they'll recover? Canon Wynne, Sister Mary, Miss Phipps?" "In time," said Marple. "Guilt fades more kindly when it comes from good intentions. They meant to preserve something sacred, not destroy it. But motives, like ink, tend to bleed through the page. You can never quite scrub them out." For a while neither spoke. The only sound was the whisper of rain against the window panes. Then Felicity said softly, "And Dr. Arkwright?" Marple looked into the fire. The flames bent and straightened, as if nodding in thought. He exposed deception, yes, but without mercy. Truth told without kindness is just another weapon. In the end, everyone was right, and everyone was wrong. Felicity sighed. I suppose that's life, isn't it? Marple smiled gently. No, my dear, that's humanity. We forge truth whenever we polish it too brightly. She reached for her cup, the porcelain warm against her hands. The sound of rain deepened steady, constant, like the quiet turning of a page. Somewhere beyond the cloisters, the cathedral bell gave one final chime, and the echoes folded into silence. Marple's eyes softened. Poor Canon Wynne, she said quietly. He only wanted his cathedral to shine again, but the brightest light always shows the dust. Felicity nodded. And you, Aunt Jane, you'll write all this down, won't you? Marple's smile was small, thoughtful. Perhaps, but not in ink. Ink stains, memory does not. She reached forward and adjusted the teapot lid, listening to its faint rattle, a small ordinary sound grounding everything back to peace. The fire glowed, the rain continued, and the world, as always, turned toward quiet order once more. And then softly, as if spoken from beyond the room, the familiar voice of the host returned. Thank you for listening. Until our next mystery, may the ink of conscience dry slowly, and may every truth you write be one you can bear to read. The fire sighed, the rain carried on, and the story, like the ink, settled into stillness.